Good evening. I'm Father Jeff Drew. I'm pastor here at St. Maximilian Kolbe Parish. We'd like to welcome you here this evening. We'd also like to welcome all those who join us via the internet this evening. Let's take a moment as we begin to quiet ourselves and recognize the Lord's presence among us, for He Himself has promised us that wherever two or three are gathered in His name, there He is in our midst. Loving God, maker of all things, you adorn all creation with splendor and beauty, and fashion human lives in your image and likeness. Awaken in every heart reverence for the work of your hands, and renew among your people a readiness to nurture and sustain your precious gift of human life. Send your peace and love, your forgiveness and healing into our hearts. Renew us with your Spirit, and help us to build a society where all human life is nurtured and respected. Grant all this through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. At this time, I'd like to introduce you Sister Alice Gerdeman, who will begin our session.
I have the somewhat simple task in one sense and more complex task in another sense of telling you what the position of the Catholic Church is on the death penalty. In one sense, it's pretty simple, and it's what you see most of the time in public media. The Catholic Church, especially through the leadership of its present Pope, its past Pope, and its Pope before that, has come out fairly strongly saying that we are in opposition in many ways to the death penalty. The exact statement that we find in the Catechism of the Catholic Church is this: assuming that the guilty party's identity and responsibility have been fully determined, the traditional teaching of the Church does not exclude the recourse to the death penalty if this is the only possible way to effectively defend human life against an unjust aggressor. If, however, non-legal means are sufficient to defend and protect people's safety from the aggressor, authority will limit itself to those means, as these are more in keeping with the concrete conditions of the common good and more in conformity to the dignity of the human person. Today, in fact, as a consequence of the possibilities which the state has for effectively preventing crime by rendering one who has committed an offense incapable of doing harm without definitively taking away from him the possibility of redeeming himself, the cases in which the execution of an offender is an absolute necessity are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Now remember, this is coming out from the Catholic Catechism, not of the United States, but of the global church. So it is after reviewing the situation in the world, the idea is it's practically non-existent that a case would come up that it would be all right to have the death penalty. People say, but we've had saints, we've had doctors of the church, we've had all kinds of people who have been for the death penalty over our history. And that's true. But Catholic social teaching is a developing tradition. It isn't a tradition that stops because society doesn't stop. Human development doesn't stop. Understanding doesn't stop. Social activity doesn't stop. It develops. We've just had an example of that within the last few years, when we have pretty much well, forever now, said we will not execute children. We did. But then we came to the realization that children are not just tiny little adults with a moral sense. They're developing. So our tradition developed to the point that we said, no, we will not execute children or even teens because they are not morally as culpable. We don't give up on them, in other words. It's a development. Within the Catholic Church, we've had since 1969, when the Vatican abolished the death penalty, and that was pretty late, but they hadn't used it for a good number of years, and I think they may have forgotten about it, or at least it wasn't top on the burner, but it became something that the world was talking about. They abolished it. So therefore, an example was given as to how a state should act. Our United States bishops took a position in opposition in 1974. And that has been reiterated and reiterated and reiterated, has had the position of the popes as they have developed, as the world has developed, as technology has made it possible to keep us safe from perpetrators of crime who may be dangerous. The last statement I could find by a Catholic moral teacher, Pope Francis, came out just about a week ago or so, March 20th, a month or so ago, March 20th, in which he said, "Today the death penalty is inadmissible no matter how serious the crime of the condemned. It's an offense against the inviolability of life and the dignity of the human person that contradicts God's plan for humans and for society, and God's merciful justice." And later on in that same document, he says, "All Christians and all people of goodwill are obliged not only to fight for the abolition of the death penalty, legal or illegal, and all its forms, but to go on and to look at the way we treat people who are imprisoned." That's the strongest position taken at the present time. None of these are what we call infallible. They are all developing, but they are very strong, and they have been reiterated both in action. Remember, Pope John Paul was shot, and he did not ask for the death penalty for the person who tried to kill him. In action and in word, they have spoken against it, primarily because the definitive Catholic teachings that they are looking at call for respect for life and for the defending of the common good. And they believe both of those traditions can best be served without the death penalty in our country or in the world. That's the nutshell. Not simple, but also simple. And now I'm going to introduce Abe Bonowitz. Abe is with Ohioans to Stop Execution, commonly known, by some of us at least, as OTSE. And he's going to facilitate tonight's program. I've known Abe for a good number of years. I don't remember exactly how long, but we have stood out in front of governors' mansions, and we've walked around streets carrying signs. And occasionally I've asked him please to pipe down because some of the rest of us had something to say too. So tonight I'm going to pipe down and let Abe have the floor for a minute as he facilitates the rest of the evening. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Sister Alice. Got a few announcements and housekeeping things I want to get out in front of us, and then we're going to get on with our program. My name is Abe Bonowitz. I'm from Columbus, and I currently live just outside of D.C. in a little town called Cheverly. And I'm pleased to be working both with Ohioans to Stop Executions and also the Delaware Repeal Project. And I want to thank especially the Archdiocese of Cincinnati and Tony Steritz, who's the director of the Catholic Social Action for the Archdiocese, one of the sponsors of this event, as well as, of course, Father Jeff Drew and everyone here at St. Maximilian Kolbe Parish. I want to thank Allison Reynolds-Berry, who is the Executive Director of the Inter-Community Justice and Peace Center, and also Sister Andrea Koverman, who's an all-around program person and volunteer and has been helping to put this all together. Also want to thank Witness to Innocence, a national organization that is made up of people who are exonerated and freed from death row, for helping sponsor the presence of Derrick Jamison. And also Amnesty International USA Special Initiatives Fund has also helped make this evening possible. For questions tonight, if you're watching the live stream, you can email me a question, Abe, A-B-E, @otse.org. So if you're watching the live stream, ABE @otse.org. And thank you to the person that's running the camera. We really appreciate your being with us tonight and zooming in if you can. And then after our four speakers, we're going to come back up and have everybody come on the panel and take questions. So for those of us that are here, if you have questions, we're going to do questions at the end after each of the four speakers. In your pews, there's a little index card, and there's a stack of index cards and some pens. And if you have a question, just write it down, who is the question for and what the question is, legibly, please. And then we'll take, when we call for questions, several people will be available to collect those, and we will then make sure all the questions are combined and get answered as appropriate. If you are a tweeter or a Facebooker or somebody that does social media, if you're watching and you want to tweet some of what you hear, please use the hashtag #FixItOrEndIt, all in one word. #FixItOrEndIt. Hashtag, and that makes these comments that you make via Twitter searchable, and we'll be able to put together a little story based on all the tweets that happened tonight. And if you're here and you want to tweet a picture or anything like that, please do. And why fix it or end it? Because Ohioans to Stop Executions, of course, is working to end the death penalty, but we recognize that not everybody in Ohio is ready. In fact, not everybody on this panel tonight is against the death penalty. But surely everybody agrees that we need to make sure it's accurate and fair. And here in Ohio, the opportunity is not yet on us to abolish the death penalty, which is the mission of Ohioans to Stop Executions. The opportunity is to pass some reform legislation based on these recommendations made by the death penalty, the Supreme Court Task Force on the Administration of Ohio's Death Penalty. We're going to hear a lot more about that tonight, and everything we hear tonight is related to that, because our mission, if we're not ready to abolish it, is to make sure that at least it is fair and accurate, and that's why we're using the hashtag #FixItOrEndIt. I also want to mention, I meant to mention this at the start, if you have your cell phone or other devices, please, now's the time to silence them. I want to briefly introduce the other staff that are here with us. Kevin, we'll have you with us, and looking forward to having a productive summer. And those are the announcements, and now we're going to get on with the program. I want to start by sharing this walking stick. Many of you who are older might know of the case of Dr. Sam Shepard, who in 1954 was arrested for the murder of his wife, Marilyn. And they tried to seek the death penalty for him. Well, Dr. Shepard and Marilyn had a son who was age 7, Sam Reese Shepard, who was sleeping in the next room when his mother was brutally beaten to death. And Sam was awakened and taken out of the house, and then started seeing the headlines. State seeks death for Dr. Sam. Sam grew up visiting his father in prison. His father they tried to get the death penalty. He got a life sentence. 10 years later or so, his sentence was overturned in Shepard versus Maxwell, and Dr. Shepard got a new and fair trial and was found not guilty and died a few years later. Well, Sam grew up as He started in the United Methodist Church. He became a seeker. He ended up becoming a Buddhist. And part of Buddhist teaching is meditation, and in particular, walking meditation as a way to get rid of your anger, to transfer it out of you and into the world, to get it away. And so you've heard the term walk it off. So Sam walked. And he walked from Boston to New Orleans in what he called his walk for alternatives to violence. And he carried this walking stick and timed his walk to arrive in New Orleans at the time of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty annual conference. And he put the stick into the auction and to raise money for the movement. And I bought it so that I could bring it and share it with folks like you tonight. There is a lot of power in this stick. It's a symbol, I see, for our movement and the journey that we're on. And I want to pass this around, give everybody a chance to share it. If you need some energy, take it out. If you've got some, put it in. But I wanted to start us out because anytime I'm doing this in Ohio, I want to make sure that we're also recognizing the long history that Ohio has with wrongful convictions, with unfairness, and with recognizing that there are people well beyond the victim and the perpetrator that are affected by this. And in particular, that's what Sam likes to talk about, is what it's like to be the child of a murder victim and oppose the death penalty, and what it's like to grow up visiting a parent in prison. With that, I want to introduce our first speaker. Judge James Brogan obtained his AAB degree from Notre Dame University in 1961 and his JD from Georgetown University Law Center in 1964. Judge, you can come on up when you're ready. He served in the United States Army from 1965 to 67 with service in Vietnam. Judge Brogan retired as a colonel in the U.S. Army JAGC. He'll define for us exactly what that means because I would butcher it. Judge Brogan entered private practice in 1964 and also, that's the Judge Advocate General, is that right? Yes. Yeah, got it. Judge Brogan entered the private practice in 1964 and also served as a first assistant county prosecuting attorney until his election in 1980 to the Second District Court of Appeals. He served as a presiding judge in 2005 and he retired in 2011. Judge Brogan has served on the Ohio Supreme Court's Board of Commissioners on Grievances and Discipline, chairman of the Ohio Judicial College, is a past Chief Justice of the Ohio Courts of Appeals Judges Association. Judge Brogan is also a fellow of the American College of Trial Lawyers and a fellow of the Ohio and American Bar Foundations. He is the author, with Judge William H. Wolf, Jr. and Shauna McSherry, of Appellate Practice and Procedure in Ohio. Judge Brogan also serves on the Supreme Court Rules Advisory Committee and has membership in numerous professional and community organizations. He's an instructor at Sinclair Community College and an adjunct professor at the University of Dayton School of Law. Judge Brogan is here tonight in his role as chairman of the Supreme Court Joint Task Force on the Administration of Ohio's Death Penalty. Now, I'm sure he's going to say this, but I want to say it too. One of the reasons we invited Judge Brogan is because he supports the death penalty, but he is committed to a system that's both fair and accurate. Judge Brogan is not a member of Ohioans to Stop Executions. He is here to share with us tonight about the work of the task force and its recommendations. Please welcome Judge James Brogan.
Dave wants me to speak loudly so that you can all hear, and I guess for this live streaming as well. Thank you for inviting me, Abe. This isn't the first time I've spoken to these symposiums, I guess we'll call them, on our work on the Joint Commission, and as well on the issues about the death penalty in Ohio. To give you some background, and I was on the prosecuting attorney's office in Montgomery County, where we had a number of homicides over the years, but the county prosecutor, Lee Falke, was very clear about seeking the death penalty only in the worst cases. So there weren't many cases over those 15 years in which I was prosecuting cases where we actually sought the death penalty. And is that better? Okay. So basically, during those 15 years that I was in the prosecuting attorney's office, I prosecuted 7 cases that resulted in a death penalty. However, the Supreme Court of the United States in the Furman versus Georgia case and in Ohio versus Lockett set aside those death sentences because of problems in Ohio's statute that did not narrow the cases in which the death penalty was appropriate. Then for the next 30 years, I served on the Court of Appeals. And in the early first 25 years, we reviewed death sentences and death penalty cases, and I participated in writing a number of opinions which set aside the death sentences. After that, after I retired in 2011, I began sitting as a trial judge. But some years earlier, before Chief Justice Moyer died, Tom and I were good friends, and he asked, if in fact the Ohio Bar Association had decided that they were going to investigate the death penalty and some of the issues that were coming about throughout the country, where it appeared that innocent people were actually being sentenced to death. And but before Tom could appoint anyone, he died. And Chief Justice O'Connor then apparently carried out Tom's wishes that I be the person that would chair the committee. The committee, as you know, it was a fairly large committee. It was about 23 people, and we met every 2 months for a couple of years. But we need to go back a little bit. The reason why in the mid-19, I think it was 1996 or 1997, the American Bar Association called for a moratorium on the death penalty. The reason why is that there had been this developing science of DNA which was revealing that, in fact, some people who had been sentenced to death were actually proven innocent by the scientific use of DNA. While it was a small number of cases, it was startling. And so the ABA recommended the moratorium. Then in Illinois, there was a number of sensational cases in which the death penalty had been imposed, in which some of these DNA and other evidence revealed that these individuals who had been sentenced to death were actually innocent. And as a matter of fact, one man came within 5 days of being executed, but for the work of journalism students at Northwestern University who had done the investigation. You may have seen it on 60 Minutes years ago, which revealed that this individual who had been identified by 2 people as the perpetrator was where they were in fact wrong, since another individual who was also already on death row in Wisconsin admitted to the crime. But basically what developed was that a number of states, the ABA began an investigation in 7 model states that had a number of death penalty prosecutions to look into what were these reasons why people could possibly be on death row and nearly executed based on evidence that when they were actually innocent. And so they did a study in these 7 states. Ohio was one of them. They came out with the recommendations in 2007 that we followed. Unfortunately, Ohio didn't pick up the cudgel and do anything about it until 2011, when I was appointed along with other members to this committee. Now, this committee was pretty well balanced. It had prosecutors, it had police, it had defense counsels, they had some professors on the committee, and they had judges. And the committee came down after 2.5 years with solid recommendations for reform. Basically, these recommendations, which I won't go into all of them, they seem pretty basic. We're trying to make sure that the system, to the extent we could do humanly, to prevent the possibility of executing an innocent person. Now, when I first got involved in this, I hadn't really thought about it, although I was pro-life and could visualize for myself the protection of the innocent fetus. I thought about cases like Timothy McVeigh and others. Remember, Timothy McVeigh is the one that went in and killed hundreds of people, including children, in Oklahoma City as a revenge for what happened when the FBI fired tear gas and started a fire out in Waco, Texas, where children were killed. And he was simply committing revenge on perfectly innocent individuals. And in those situations, perhaps I thought that could be justified based on a belief that it was a moral statement or a statement of society that we have to say something about such an horrendous act, so horrendous evil, where it's premeditated to go out and kill so many people, including innocent people, and where the perpetrator was certainly not a child. So basically, throughout this 2.5 years, I continue to believe that the death penalty was appropriate for the worst of the worst, and only where the evidence was very, very strong. In other words, where the trier of fact could only find that they were absolutely certain of the individual's guilt. In any event, over this 2-year period in reviewing the death penalty, the prosecutors believed that I was an abolitionist, and as a matter of fact, that my views expressed pretty strongly about how strong I thought the evidence should be to address many of the failures in the system, suggested to them that I was really in favor of abolishing the death penalty. Many of the prosecutors, well, some of the defense lawyers asked for a moratorium, just like it happened in Illinois. And when the moratorium was suggested, the prosecutors indicated that they would walk out if, in fact, a moratorium were suggested by our task force. So we completed our work, and we came down with these recommendations. Now, it had always been my view that in Ohio, perhaps, being a fairly conservative state, particularly in the rural areas, that it was unlikely that Ohio was going to do away with the death penalty. So if we must insist on having the death penalty, then it should be used very sparingly and only for the worst cases and only where the evidence was extremely strong. Well, one thing I learned over this 2.5 years is how strong the abolition movement is going. And as I mentioned to Kevin earlier, the leadership in the abolition movement, not only from people like yourself and other members of the church, but it also, the leadership has come from the leaders of the states. It hasn't come from the President of the United States. It has come from, or the legislators, it has come from the governors. In the last few years, last 6 or 7 years, 7 states have abolished the death penalty. Nebraska just did. And in many of these cases, the governor was a conservative Republican who asked for and led the abolition of the death penalty. One of the candidates for the President of the United States is Martin O'Malley, who was at the forefront of the leadership of doing away with the death penalty in Maryland, which is one of the last states to do away with the death penalty. And I suggested to Kevin that I thought the weak link is the governor, that you may not be able to get the legislature to act on abolition of the death penalty. It may not be the numbers, but there's only one governor, and if the governor takes the lead, and I think that it's entirely possible that Governor Kasich, when confronted with the foibles and failures of our system and the resistance that law enforcement has to our changes in the law may in fact step forward and say, well, I'll step forward and act. And one of the things I wanted to point out to you was an article by Kirsten Powers. You may have seen Kirsten on TV, and she talks about, in her editorial, if I can find it here quickly, about recent conservatives who have spoke out in favor of abolishing the death penalty. For many reasons. Conservatives are often pro-life. They're also for getting the government out of our lives and for saving, for budgetary constraints. Many of the reasons for doing away with the death penalty. The death penalty is extremely expensive to do it properly. And when I say do it properly, I mean that if you're going to accuse somebody of something that can result in their death, surely we must have a system that makes sure that the accusation is proven beyond all doubt, and with the defendant having the best counsel that he can have in order to test the evidence of the state. One thing you should know, and prosecutors seldom lose cases. Why? Because we have the backup of the police and all their investigative capability. Defendants do not have that. Defendants are often poor and who see their lawyers only infrequently and do not have the possibility of defending the case. We also, in a death case, try cases to death-eligible jurors. What do I mean by that? I mean jurors who believe in the death penalty are the only jurors who actually are selected. Those who are opposed to the death penalty cannot serve. Now, death-eligible people tend to be law enforcement-minded. Death penalty cases tend to be sensational cases, high pressure on prosecutors to bring death prosecutions and to win them sometimes at all costs. And police officers sometimes do not understand that their role is to make sure that only the wrongfully accused or the rightfully accused are found guilty. I worked for a prosecuting attorney, Lee Falke, for many years. And I thought of the quote of Louis Brandeis. Justice Brandeis once said many years ago when they were prosecuting some people who were involved in illegal liquor trafficking during Prohibition, and they did so by wiretapping the defendant's telephone. And Justice Brandeis thought that wiretapping was a great intrusion on the personal liberty of citizens, and he would not go along with the evidence being used in court. And he said the government is the omnipresent teacher. For good or ill, it teaches by its example. And that's what I tried to do in the 15 years I was a prosecutor and the 30 years I was a judge. And perhaps that's why they asked that I be the chairman of this committee. Now, there are a number of things that we have asked be done. And one of the things that was really disquieting was after we came out, after working 2.5 years on these recommendations to ensure only the guilty people are found guilty, and make sure that the sentence is appropriate, taking into account all the mitigating factors, things like severe mental illness and so on and so forth. We came out with all these recommendations. Prosecutors came out and were highly critical of our report. They said in a sharply worded dissent, a minority faction led by county prosecutors denounced the Ohio Supreme Court Penalty Task Force as ignoring its mission and working to abolish capital punishment. And the work of the task force, the prosecutors said, were strongly influenced by a pro-defense majority bent on an agenda of abolition, and they opposed it. Now, one thing they ignored is that the large percentage of the people on this committee were not for defense-oriented. There was only a few that were on the defense side. The majority of the members were college professors or law professors. or judges who thought that these were appropriate recommendations. The Columbus Dispatch, after this dissent came out, within a couple days said that these recommendations should be disregarded. We had spent 2.5 years, and in a short editorial said they should not be listened to. We know that they are going to be listened to. We know that there are bills that are introducing these reforms such as at least not executing people who at the time they committed the offense were suffering a severe mental illness. What kind of society do we have that we would execute people who are suffering from psychosis at the time they commit their offense, and that drives their behavior? We also recommended that all confessions, in many of these cases in which people were acquitted, were found innocent. And just think of it, we finished our work in March of this year. Since we finished our work, 11 more people have been found innocent who are on death row in the United States. 11 more people. There are now 153 people, or 155 people, who have been proven to be innocent who are on death row. Many of them confessed to the crime. All we asked is that these be recorded so that the jury could determine whether the person gave truly a free and voluntary statement. What kind of mental state was the individual in at the time he confessed? So we asked that they be recorded. 22 states require that they be recorded in all felony prosecutions. No, they resisted it. So what we came up with was, okay, we will presume that they're involuntary if they're not recorded. The prosecutors and police rejected that. And we recommended that the proportionality in review in some counties in this state, the death penalty is never sought. 46 counties, they don't even seek the death penalty. They don't have the money. In some counties, like Cuyahoga County, there are 10 times as many death penalty prosecutions as in other counties in the state. If you kill a white person, whether you're black or white, you have 2 times as much a chance of receiving the death penalty. Felony murder cases, some prosecutors routinely indict for felony murder. And it seems that, in other words, if somebody is killed in the perpetration of a robbery or something of that nature, he faces the death penalty. I personally believe that the only time the death penalty should ensue is when somebody does a cold-blooded killing with prior calculation and design, like Timothy McVeigh did in Oklahoma City. But we need to have some uniformity. So we have recommended that there be a charging committee of prosecutors that would decide when to pursue a death penalty. So we don't have a different view of a prosecutor in Cincinnati than you might have for the prosecutor in Dayton or Columbus. After all, it is the state of Ohio versus the defendant. And as I said, there are a number of other things. A capital litigation fund that would provide for experts for the defendant. So many people had been convicted on phony evidence by so-called experts. Have there been people executed who are probably innocent? No doubt there has been. And we need to require enhanced reliability, and we need to prevent certain kind of evidence from coming into the courtroom. We need to improve discovery, which the prosecutors resist as well. Discovery means the defendant should know everything that the prosecution knows. Why should the prosecutor have evidence that he has not disclosed? We must make sure that evidence favorable to the defendant. Are there other possible suspects to be disclosed to the defendant? There are a number of these recommendations, and I won't get into them in complete detail. I ask that you study them. Again, I can think of nothing worse than a person would be sentenced to death and be executed for a crime he did not commit or she did not commit. And unless we take these and make these recommendations that our committee has spent so much time to do, I will oppose the death penalty completely. And I've indicated that to others who have asked of me. I recommend to you a book by Scott Turow. It's called Ultimate Punishment. Scott is a partner in Sonashim, Nath, and Rosenblum in Chicago. He's written a number of books. You may have seen the movie Presumed Innocent with Harrison Ford, which Scott wrote as a fiction. But Scott is a very thoughtful former U.S. attorney and a major partner in a law firm in Chicago. And he talks about his time in the Illinois Commission, similar to my time on the Ohio Commission. And he talks about some reflections that I think are so meaningful. In confronting murder, says Scott, we as a society ask how we should face an ultimate evil, which, if unchecked, would reduce almost all human interaction to war. We want to punish in order to prevent murder, but also as part of our effort to restore ourselves from the anxieties it raises about our ability to live with one another. I have always suspected that what we want most from punishment, beginning with the moments when we first hit someone back as young children, is restoration. The pain will leave us and go instead into the person we hurt. Given that, I have occasionally wondered as I've listened to the surviving family of murder victims, if in some shadowed place in their heart is the hope that the death of the killer would somehow restore their lost loved one to life. Perhaps that's an explanation, but it just shows how thoughtful Scott was in doing so. Another thing I just wanted to point out, but if my time on the commission, Scott said, taught me one lesson, it was that I was approaching the question of capital punishment the wrong way. There will always be cases that cry out to me for ultimate punishment. That's not the true issue. The pivotal question is whether a system of justice can be constructed that reaches only the rare right cases without also occasionally condemning the innocent or the undeserving. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Brogan. So for those of you who have joined us watching the live feed online, thank you for doing so. I want to, again, encourage questions from folks watching the live feed. You can email them to me at abe@otse.org. That's abe@otse.org. And we'll be taking questions up after our four speakers. Judge Brogan mentioned Nebraska. The legislature in Nebraska passed a bill to repeal the death penalty, making Nebraska the sixth state to legislatively repeal the death penalty, the seventh to end its use of the death penalty since 2007. And today, the governor of Nebraska vetoed that bill. And the good news is that if all the legislators who voted for that bill keep voting for that bill, we're going to override that veto. And that's going to happen sometime in the next 5 days. And we'll be celebrating one more state without the death penalty. I want to note Allison, if you could bring that up here so it gets into the stream as well. Just come and hold it right up here. This is the cover of, I think you need to move just a little bit further. There we go. Thank you. This is the cover of our report that we issued last year, the death lottery, how race and geography determine who goes to Ohio's death row. This is OTSI's first annual report of its type. It gets really deep into statistics and how the system is working, and in a very readable way. It's available on our website at www.otsc.org, otsi.org. And the other report, you want to grab the other one, please? Perfect, thank you. The other one is the one that we just issued this year. It's called Crumbling Institution, Why Ohio Must Fix or End the Death Penalty. And this gets really much deeper into all of the task force recommendations and how they can impact things and why they're important. And again, this is also available on our webpage, www.otsc.org. You just click, you can either find it right on the front page or under the resources tab. And I want to note that in your pews are also flyers. Thanks, Allison. In your pews are also flyers. There's one that talks about the task force recommendations, and on the other side it has information from the death lottery report. And by the way, I want to note that title, the death lottery, comes from what Justice Paul Pfeiffer calls the death penalty now. He's a Supreme Court justice, but he's also one of the authors of Ohio's death penalty law. He wrote our law, and now he calls it a lottery, and he calls for its repeal. And he's profiled in both of these reports as to why he supports ending the death penalty. So you have the flyer about the death lottery there, and there's another one that talks a little bit about the Crumbling Institution report. So these are available online, and I want to encourage everybody to check them out and to point the people, direct people to them, especially if they have questions about Ohio's death penalty. Our next speaker is Terry Collins. Terry Collins retired as director after 32 years and 7 months with the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. Terry Collins received his bachelor's degree in sociology and corrections from Morehead State University and his master's in correctional administration from Xavier University. It's been a pleasure to get to know Terry over these past several years. One of the things he's shared with me is that one of his least favorite activities is visiting legislators. But I have to tell you, it's something he's very good at. As I witnessed just a couple weeks ago when I brought him to meet with legislators in the other state I work in Delaware, Terry knows his stuff. I want to thank also his wife Linda is here for putting up with all of his travel and for supporting him and for coming out to these events and sitting through all this over and over again. We really appreciate you and your support. In his retirement, Terry consults with a variety of clients, and really I think the best way to introduce him is to quote one of them, an attorney, who wrote, Terry could be my favorite witness ever. He's clear and incisive and speaks with the simple power that can only come from honesty. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Terry Collins.
Thanks, Abe. Good evening. Well, a little bit about me. I come from a little town called Hillsboro, Ohio, over in Highland County, about 65 miles from here. It was a very social, conservative, and religious community. You went to church on Sunday night, you went to church on Wednesday evening, and you went to church Sunday morning. And it wasn't a far travel for me because I was raised right across the driveway from the church. Went to school in Hillsboro High School, as Abe said, on to Morehead State University in Kentucky, and then to Xavier. And then and today, I still believe in punishment of those who violate the laws of society, and I know many people who should never get out of prison. I did work 32 and a half years for the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction. Started in 1977, retired in February of 2010. I was a warden at Lucasville. I worked in London, was a warden at Lorraine Correctional Institution, warden at Ross Correctional Institution in Chillicothe, where I currently reside. I worked in central office for over 10 years, where I was the director for the last 3.5 years while I was employed. I oversaw an institution in a state of 50,000 inmates, 12,000 employees, and $1.7 billion of your money was my yearly budget. As I said, I worked 3.5 years as the director of the agency. You know, I never really thought about the death penalty until I started working in prison. Actually, I never even thought about prison. Where I grew up, there wasn't many people who went to prison. Very rural community, very religious community, so hearing about somebody who went to prison was a very odd thing. But I ended up in prison work, and I never really thought about the death penalty, except in the early stage of my career, there was a gentleman by the name of Gary Beeman. I was a social worker at the Southern High Correctional Facility. Gary was on my caseload. Gary was on death row. He left the prison one morning. I, of course, asked where he was going, and they said, well, he's going back out to court for a new trial. A few weeks later, I asked, was Gary coming back? No, Gary had been found not guilty. He served as his own attorney, went out to court, and I believe it was Ashtabula County, if my memory serves me correctly, where he was found not guilty and released from death row. I interviewed many inmates who came off death row in either 79 or 80 when the death penalty in this state was ruled unconstitutional, and they were returned back into what we call the general population of the state prisons. I was involved in taking an inmate and walking him off death row into the death house in 1994, when at that time the state had both electric chair and lethal injection. Inmates could choose the method of execution. It's one of the few people that I can remember the names of those 33 that I witnessed execution. That was John Byrne. John was from Hamilton County. Later that night, and at that time executions were at midnight, at around midnight that night, the United States Supreme Court stayed his case, and I walked John back to death row at Lucasville. I was the warden at the Southern High Correctional Facility after the riot in 1993, and I was there in 95 when we decided to move death row from Lucasville to the Mansfield Correctional Institution in Mansfield, Ohio. As I said earlier, I have witnessed 33 executions in my various roles with the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections and 1 execution in the state of Texas. Many people ask me, well, why has your stance on the death penalty changed? And I'm going to tell you reasons as to why my stance has changed. First of all, fairness of the system. Getting the death penalty should not be based on what county you're arrested in, what your economic status is, or what your race is. The system should be fair. I don't accept the explanation that I often hear about, well, only the worst of the worst get the death penalty. Believe me, ladies and gentlemen, I've walked the hallways and cell blocks and corridors of every prison in the state hundreds of times. I worked in the maximum security prison in the state for a total of 7 years. I have seen many inmates who had worse cases than those who were on death row. We live in the best country in the world, and we probably have the best justice system in the world. But our system can make mistakes, and it does make mistakes. Too many mistakes that have been found later to be not guilty. 9 of them here in the state of Ohio, hundreds across the United States. You're going to have the opportunity to hear from one of those people in just a few minutes. I have personally walked 3 people out of prison who were later found to be not guilty, 2 of which were doing life sentences for murder. One of them happened to be on my caseload when I started in 1977 and told me every time I met with him, Mr. Collins, I'm not guilty of this case. And my response was, you may not be. However, because you're here, I got to assume you are because the court said you were, and therefore my responsibility is to keep you until the parole board says it's time for you to go home. When I worked that person out the front door and stood on the steps of the London Correctional Institution, that person said to me, as he was walking down the steps, see, Mr. Collins, I told you I was not guilty. The only thing I could say was, I'm sorry. Ohio has an option over the death penalty. It's called life without parole. Life without parole means that you have no opportunity for release other than if the governor were to commute your sentence or if the courts, the judge, were to change your sentence. You will not see the parole board. You will not have opportunity for release. and it's life without parole. It started somewhere in 1996, 97, I believe, and it's been used quite frequently. Today, I went on the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction website, looked at their monthly report that they put up every month, looked for May. And on that report, it shows how many people's on death row. There's 141. It shows how many people's doing life without parole in the system. There are currently today 527 people in the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction who are doing life without parole. 527. When I was going out to Delaware to work with Abe a couple weeks ago, I looked, there was only 521. So it's being used quite frequently in this state. Another interesting fact, we have life without parole, but if I look at the number of people on death row, that 141, there's a huge percentage of those individuals, and the last time I actually sat down and worked a little number chart, there were 62 people that were on death row prior to 1997. That would be roughly 45% of those that was currently on death row. There was no life without parole, so therefore they never had that option to be granted a sentence of life without parole. They never had an option to plea bargain for life without parole. I wonder how many of those people would be there if that law had been in place. I wonder why we don't go back and look at those cases and grant that opportunity, since they did not have that opportunity. I've seen the effect on victims' families and the condemned families who waited 10, 15, 20, 25 years through appeals and continuing reliving of events. I talk to those people in the mornings of executions. I've seen the effect on staff who conduct executions. There's a team at the Southern High Correctional Facility who volunteers their time to conduct executions for the state of Ohio. They probably have the hardest job in the state of Ohio and in state government. I know it affects them. I've seen that. I've seen them sweat. I've seen them ridiculed because they tried to make it as humane as possible. I've seen them ridiculed in court by both sides. So I know what effect it has on those individuals. Believe me, it does change people. 33 executions driving to Lucasville from Chillicothe, where I live and have resided since 1997. Often wondered one thing. Did the system get it right? I was getting ready to witness someone being executed. Did the system get it right? People say, well, Mr. Collins, you know, there's been 42 judges looked at this case, and they all said it was okay. Still didn't answer the question, did they get it right? Because they were looking for, were the T's crossed and were the I's dotted? They didn't really care whether there was prosecutor misconduct or whether there was evidence was hid off in a closet somewhere or whether there was new evidence. They were concerned about was the process and the due process given during the trial. Did the system get it right? I don't know that of the 33 people I've seen executed that any of them were innocent. None of them proclaimed that in their last statement. But statistical data would say that the probability exists that there was somebody of those 33 that I've seen executed that would have been not guilty. I often asked that every time I went to Lucasville. I wondered that every time I spoke to that condemned inmate about 45 minutes prior to their execution. Because for me to get into the death house and get to the area where the team was and get into the area where I would witness the execution and do the functions that I had to carry out in my various roles, I had to walk by the cell. And I spoke to each of those 33 people. And I'm going to tell you something amazing. 32 of the 33 said thank you. Thanked me for what my staff did with them for the prior 24 hours of their execution. That made me feel good, but I still had that question. Did this system get it right? I think it's time we start educating society about the death penalty, and not only the death penalty, but the criminal justice system as a whole. I believe that Ohio could do away with the death sentence and have no harmful effect on this state. In fact, I think it would be considered progressive We already have the life without parole punishment. It's certainly frequently used, 527 people currently in the system. Life in prison without parole offers justice that is swift, certain, effectively severe, and perhaps more sensitive to the needs of families. I understand this is a very emotional issue, but we still have to look at the facts, and we have to use good moral judgments and social values in deciding what is best for society. I've reviewed and briefly studied the task force recommendations that Judge Brogan spoke to. I didn't sit on that task force, nor was I asked to testify before that task force, but I certainly agree with the majority of their recommendations. In fact, most of them are just good common sense. I fully support that legislation take swift and affirmative action to enact the greatest majority of these recommendations. As I stand here tonight, I am happy to report that thanks to Senator Bill Seitz, Senator Sandra Williams, and Senator Charlita Taveras, bills have been introduced to codify 5 of the 56 recommendations. It's a positive start, actually much faster than I had previously predicted. But it's only a small step. But keep in mind, small steps start a million-mile journey. I know the bills will create much debate and political positioning, but I still emphasize there's absolutely no reason in this state that we should not move forward with the bill on mental health. We don't need any debate. We don't need any pause. We don't need any hesitation to pass the bill that is currently existing, been introduced, Senate Bill 162, that persons with serious mental illness not be charged nor receive the death penalty. There should be no debate about that issue. It should be passed immediately without hesitation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Terry. For those of you following online, again, we're starting to get questions coming in. You can send questions to abe, @otse.org. And for those of you that are tweeting, use the hashtag #FixItOrEndIt, hashtag #FixItOrEndIt. I'm going to try to speed things up a little bit because I realize we need to try to end close to or not too far after 9. So Derrick Jamison is our next speaker. And in thinking about introducing him, the word that came to my mind was joy. That's really the only word that can be used to describe our next speaker. Derrick Jamison is going to tell you his own story, but I want to tell you this. Despite the fact that he went to the school of hard knocks, this guy has the greatest spirit. He's always up and happy. He's always texting me just to say hi, and he's never said no to anything I've asked him to do. Derrick is here tonight with his neighbor and friend, Katrina Wilson. And Katrina, who drove him here, Katrina is like the Hurricane Katrina. She is herself a force to be reckoned with. And I want to just note she's the president and CEO of the Freedom Community Development Corporation in Middletown, not too far from here. She's doing terrific work to help build better relations between citizens and law enforcement and other things. Katrina, thank you for all you do to support Derrick and to help him do this work. Derrick's participation tonight is sponsored in part by Witness to Innocence, a national organization whose members are, like Derrick, among the 153 people on the official list of those who have been exonerated from their conviction and have been sentenced to be executed in the United States. Check them out at witnesstoinnocence.org. That's witnesstoinnocence.org. Please give a warm welcome to Derrick Jamison.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, my name is Derrick Jamison, and I was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio. I'm the 119th death row exoneree in the United States. In 1984, I was living in Cincinnati at the time. I grew up in Cincinnati. I love Cincinnati. See, I got my dreads hat on, even though it's blue. I grew up in Cincinnati, and, oh man, was a beautiful thing growing up in Cincinnati. You know, I went to Catholic school when I was young. Oh, okay. I forget how to talk. Well, I grew up in Cincinnati, and in 1985, I was charged with a crime of armed robbery and aggravated murder. A young man by the name of Gary Mitchell. His family owned a nightclub in Cincinnati. On August the 1st of 1984, somebody went into his family establishment and attacked this young man. And like 8 days later, Gary died. And I never met him before. I didn't know nothing about him. I didn't know nothing about his family. I had never been in a bar or nothing, nightclub or nothing. But in October the 25th of 1985, I was sentenced to die for the murder of Gary Mitchell, a young man that me and him never came in contact. We were around the same age. Gary was around 23 or 24 too. I was 23 at the time when I was sentenced to die. And I remember my first day arriving in Lucasville, and they had the welcoming party waiting for me. Terry was there. The guards cleared the hallways in Lucasville. Lucasville is really big, supermax security. And they cleared all the hallways to bring me down the hallways to, I think it was J4, where they kept the electric chair at. But I remember my first day, I was walking down this hallway in Lucasville with all these guards. And I remember I got to J4 and they brought me in here and I had to change clothes and they, get all the paperwork and everything ready. But I remember I was taking off all my clothes. I was standing there with no clothes on. It was men and women guards there at the time. But only thing I can remember was looking up at the death house for the electric chair. They called him Old Sparky. And I had just been sent to die in this chair. And I was still devastated because I knew that I'd been sent to death. I knew it was going to destroy my family, I knew it was going to just destroy my family because I knew how close me and my mom and my brothers and sisters were. And I remember they taking me to my first cell block, K4, death row. And you could hear all the noise of people playing music, all kind of people trying to talk at the same time. It was this big roar coming. You could hear it out in the hallway. But when the guards opened the door to take me into K4, it got real quiet. And I could hear the guys on death row saying, he's here, he's here, he's here, And the first cell I arrived in was cell 27 in K4. Cell 27 in K4. And I remember this long walk down this long range in Lucasville. And I was looking at the guys in the cell as I was walking down the range. It wasn't nothing kids, These were young men like me. I was 23 and most of them were calling me an old man. And I remember the first two guys, they moved next door to me. A guy by the name of Richard Cooley and a guy by the name of Danny Hill. Danny Hill was like 18, and I think Richard Cooley, he was 19. Young men, teenagers. And I remember Danny couldn't even read or write. I used to have to read his mail for him and stuff like that, This man couldn't even write home to his parents or nothing. He didn't know how to, he was borderline, I hate calling people retarded, but he was borderline retarded. He couldn't comprehend what was going on around him. But he was sentenced to die. And later on in the years, Like in 1999, a young man from out of Texas, he wasn't even from Ohio, by the name of Wilford Byrne, he volunteered to be executed. 1999. Now, they hadn't killed nobody. It hadn't been an execution in Ohio since 1963. And Barry volunteered to be executed. And I remember that morning. I remember that day they were killing Barry. Man, I thought that was the most awful thing in the world. Even though he volunteered and he did what he did, it was just like, this man, knowing he's gonna die on the day, when he volunteered to be murdered and they executed. And it was like a dark cloud came across Ohio because they started killing so many of my friends, they were the media was calling these guys monsters. These guys was human beings. All 53 people that's been executed in Ohio, they was human beings. And in 2005, October the 25th, actually it's the same day I was sent to die. October the 25th of 2005, I walked off the death row with 3 men. And I witnessed some of the most horrible things you could ever mention on death row. Like, most people say they've been to jail, but I ain't been to jail. I've been here, You bet, 53 people in the lifetime that's been murdered, taken out these cells by people that were sworn to protect them, take their lives. I feel so sorry for them guards that have to carry out the execution. How could you go home at night knowing you killed a human being? But I watched so many of my friends get murdered. And I remember forget that a couple of friends of mine have been murdered. And I was on death row and I used to holler out their name. And I hear people crying because they know a guy was dead already. But in 2005, October the 25th, the same day, was the worst day of my life, became the best day of my life. But it was still sad because a lot of my supporters had passed away, especially my biggest supporter, my mom. I remember in 1997, I was sitting on my bed listening to Christmas music, and the guard showed up at my door, and he told me that my mom had passed away that morning. And it still hurt to this day, because like I said, when I was sent to die, I knew this was going to destroy my family, and it did. People still, my family members still suffer from what happened to me. Should no family have to go through this, In the state of Ohio, we got a thing called life without parole. We need to use it because we're making too many mistakes in the United States with the death penalty. We got 153 death row exonerees in this country as we speak. And some more that's coming out. It's a lot of more. It's going to be a lot more. And as you know, I was 119th death row exoneree in the United States. And we're the only civilized country that's still killing our citizens. And I think in my heart, I know that the death penalty is a human rights violation. I speak all over the world. They brought me to Rome, Italy to honor me for what I do in the United States. And I'm going to continue to let my voice be heard on the death penalty because killing is wrong. And we got a thing in Ohio called life without parole. If you make a mistake with life without parole, you can go free this man. But if you make a mistake with the death penalty, you can't go dig this man up and say, excuse me, my bad, I'm sorry. And we making too many mistakes. Sister Helen Prejohn, I remember when we started the Innocence Tour, me and two other guys was on death row with me, Joe Ambrosia and Derrick Jamison. Sister Helen started off our tour with a speech, and she was talking about the day they executed a young man by the name of Lewis Williams. And she said, the day they came to execute Lewis, the guards came to his cell, and they said, Lewis, you know, they tried to get him up out of his cell, but this little bitty guy who was from Cleveland, Ohio, Tioga County, he grabbed a hold of the bar and was screaming, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. I didn't do this. I ain't got nothing to do with this, but they executed him anyway. And a lot of people think Lewis Williams was dead before he even made it to the death house because he put up a fight. He refused to come out their cell. He put up a fight and it cost him his life. But they were going to kill him anyway. But they said, even the USA Today said Lewis could have been dead before he even got on the gurney. When they even put him on the gurney. And it's stories like that give me the power and the strength to fight on and end the death penalty in the state of Ohio. Not just the state of Ohio, but all over the world. We need to end this madness. You know, killing is wrong. All 53 of my friends that was executed in the state of Ohio, on each one of their death certificate, it's got homicide. You know what? Homicide means murder. That means all 53 of my friends were taken out of their cell and murdered. Let's stop this madness. Let's stop this killing. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. God bless y'all.
Thank you, my friend. I'm going to keep this up because this next guy's a pretty tall guy here, too. So in your pews is also this flyer, which for those of you watching online, you can get at otsc.org under the resources tab. It says on one side, if the state had its way, I'd be dead today. And it shows you the 9 Ohio death row survivors, 9 people who've been wrongly sent to Ohio's death row, and briefly tells their story. And on the other side, it lists 13 of the 56 recommendations from the Supreme Court Task Force, which we believe if these 13 were all implemented, they would have prevented, and they will prevent future wrongful executions. They won't prevent all of them, but they'll make it a lot harder for that to happen. So be sure to take this and the other flyers, and there's more of some of them on the table in the back, and others, and they can all be downloaded also from our website at otsc.org. Our next speaker is Joe Byrne. And before I introduce Joe, I want to tell you that I serve as the volunteer state death penalty abolition coordinator for Amnesty International USA. And Joe's trip here and participation with us is in large part sponsored by a grant from the Volunteer Managed Special Initiatives Fund of Amnesty International USA. There's also a number of local volunteers here with Amnesty, and if you're here from Amnesty, welcome and thanks for coming. January 11th, 2013, I received an email. It wasn't just to me, but it was to the OTSI discussion group, the Yahoo group, and it was from Joe Byrne. It was a confession and an apology and an offer. Joe named me among several others he wanted to apologize to. To be honest, I can't remember being on the receiving end of Joe's anger, but I read his letter and it ended with this. I want to help your mission any way that I possibly can. A voice, an interview, write letters on your behalf, you name it. I think maybe I'm being selfish by doing this, but if it can help a person or a family, I want to do it. I made a trip to New Jersey, where Joe Byrne lives, because I wanted to look him in the eye and judge for myself just how genuine he was. We met at the diner and we talked for several hours, and my friends, this man is genuine. And today's return to Ohio is the culmination of several years of talking and planning and figuring out how and when and exactly why to bring Joe Byrne here. This is the first time that Joe Byrne is speaking against the death penalty publicly in Ohio. Before I bring him up, I want to warn you. This is powerful stuff, and it's hard. Joe Byrne is no slouch. He was captain of the football team and co-captain of the basketball team in high school. He saw the prettiest girl he ever laid eyes on and decided he was going to get her to marry him. Joe Byrne has a Bachelor's of Science in Accounting from Georgetown College in Kentucky and a Master's of Business Administration with a concentration in finance from the Stern Business School at New York University. And he was cum laude in both. Ladies and gentlemen, listen carefully, because tonight is not the ending, it's the beginning. Come on up, Joe. We are counting on you to share what you are hearing tonight. And sooner or later, when you find yourself in conversation about the death penalty, someone's going to say to you, you would feel different if someone you loved was murdered. And you know what? When I hear that, I affirm it. I say, you're right. It hasn't happened to someone I love, but God forbid it ever does. I hope I have learned from the experiences of the many victims' families that I know. Friends like Bill Pelkey and Suzanne Bosler, and I share their stories. So listen carefully to your friend and mine, Joe Byrne.
Never mechanical, I'm sorry. First off, Derrick, God bless you. It's a horrible thing that happened to you, and I know there's others like that. Okay, I'm going to go through my story. Abe will bump me if I'm talking too much, because I can talk for a very long time on this. I've got mixed emotions being here, because one of the worst things in my life happened very close to here, and that is the murder of my wife Sherry in 1985. I grew up in Franklin, Ohio, a town not far from here, with my family. I had 3 siblings. I graduated from Franklin High School in 78. Abe bought my stuff about me being a stud and all that, but I was very active in sports, and I loved sports, and I took my academics very serious. I'm a Catholic. Went to church in St. Mary's Church in Middletown, Ohio, and as Abe said, I graduated from Georgetown in 82. And then NYU in 95, I think. This is Sherry. I met her in December of 1982. And she's obviously gorgeous. She was equally bubbly. She was about 17 here. I met her when she was 19. A very caring person. She didn't know a stranger. She knew everybody. I mean, she was a friend to everybody. And she cared about people so much. I was mush in her hands. She's 5'1", 100 pounds. And, I'm a pretty big guy. But I was mush. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat after I met her. It was one of those things. And our relationship developed very fast. She had what I miss the most, she had the cutest little giggle that I really missed it. Anyway, we got married August 18th, 1984. So it was a pretty fast romance. And for Christmas of 84, I bought her a puppy dog named Bo, a little Cairn Terrier. We socialized with who ended up being her killer, David Brewer, and his wife, Kathy. We didn't get together a whole lot, but we did get together a few times. In I got so many notes. I'm just going to talk. The last time we really saw the Brewers was about 2 months before Sherry was killed, which was March 21st of 85. They'd come down to our place to help us break in our new apartment. We just moved to Springdale. And they came down, and we just had pizza and a couple beers, and we talked, and Sherry was so excited. She was so excited. She told them, we're going to have a baby. We're going off birth control. And Brewer worked in an appliance rental place, and he told me, your speakers suck, Joe. He goes, your stereo speakers. And he said, I repossess these all the time in his job, his appliance rental place. And he said if he came across a good pair, he'd hold them for us. This was the end of January of 85. March 21st of 85, 10:15 at my office in downtown Cincinnati. I worked for what is now Ernst & Young. And Sherry called me, and she was all excited. She said that the Brewers had just called her, and that they had said that they found out they were pregnant, and they drove down to northern Cincinnati, which made sense because of all the nice hotels north of the GE plant, and that he had some stereo speakers for us. So Sherry ran out of the house with our puppy dog Bo that I just gotten her for Christmas. And that was the last time I talked to her. It was that phone call. While Sherry was quote unquote missing, I remember that night I got home from about 6:30 at night, and I realized something wasn't right because she wasn't home. She was an immaculate housekeeper, and the bathroom was how I left it, which was a mess every morning. And it was not cleaned up, and so I thought, something's not right. So I started calling friends and family, and then I called, I thought, well, first, let me back up. First of all, I went around my apartment. I just knew something was really bad, and I can remember opening the closet doors and being afraid what I was going to find. And then at the same time looking under the bed, being afraid of what I was going to find. And my mind was, I knew something had happened. And so then I thought, oh, you dummy, call the Brewers, because of that phone call I got. And it turned out that Kathy answered the phone. David was, as it turned out, was in the act of killing Sherry at that time. And I'll get into that in a second. But I said, Kathy, when you saw Sherry today, where'd Joe, we didn't see Sherry. I said, Kathy, are you pregnant? She goes, no, I'm not pregnant. I said, oh my God, where's Dave? And she goes, he's not here. I was convinced it was someone who infatuated with her and knew that the two couples knew each other. I never thought it was him. And then I called the police. I called my dad, who drove down from Middletown. One of my good friends from college lived nearby. He came over to my house. I called the cops. I called hospitals. I called everybody. And one of my friends, Joe Jordan, from college, as I said, came over to my house, and he helped me, supported me because I was a basket case. I was scared to death. And Springdale police, I called them, talked to them. I battled with them for 4 days because the stereotype is the husband always does it. And I was accused of all that. Well, you beat her up, or you're having an affair and she's getting even with you. And I was infuriated. I was just infuriated. While she was, quote unquote, missing, David Brewer and his wife came down to our house because we had organized a group of people to pass out flyers all over Southwest Ohio. Can you guys hear me okay? Because a couple people look like they're straining. But anyway, and David Brewer and his wife came down and to help us pass out flyers. And then he left. Well, I should back up a little bit because that Thursday night also, with the Springdale police, they wouldn't let me file a 24 hours of missing person report. Joe, my friend, knew the area, and he said, Joe, I'm going to go look around because I know the area better than you. And he found Sherry's car. And it was hidden in an apartment complex right behind Hotel Row, if you will, near Springdale. And the police, I talked to them. I said, let's go over to the car. And the cop took me over there. And I said, we got to open the trunk. And they said, I will arrest you if you open the trunk. And so Joe and I stayed there and watched the car all night. And of course, once the cop left, I went over and I opened up the trunk. And Sherry was not in that trunk. So then, the next day, as I said, a lot of people came over and helped for the next few days. I was in battles back and forth with Springdale cops. March 26th was a Tuesday morning. And I called the Springdale cops and said, what's going on? Because I knew they had interviewed me the day before. They were interviewing Joe Jordan because they were suspicious of him. How did he find the car? And they were interested in Brewer. Well, the cops came over I called them that morning. They come over. They say the door's open and a priest and 2 cops walked in. I collapsed. I said, Brewer killed her, didn't he? Yeah. So, as it turned out, I learned a lot of this later, he was infatuated with her and tricked her into coming over. I told you about the stereo speakers and the pregnancy. And he testified that she went crazy when he tried to spring on her. He wanted to start an affair, despite all the media back then and all the different stories. He said she freaked out. Said, Joe's going to kill you. Joe's going to kill you for doing this. He ended up beating her up, raping her, tying her up, throwing her in the trunk of the car, binding her with speaker wire, as I said, and tape. And he drove all over Southwest Ohio with Sherry in the trunk and the dog in the trunk, except about 4 hours after the encounter at the hotel, he let the dog loose. But only after he removed the tags that had Sherry's name on it. So clearly, it was a premeditated murder. But he drove all over the place, and he was up near Beaver Creek, Ohio. Sherry managed, with lipstick and a big envelope, to write, "Help me, please." And she got it out of the trunk. And he never knew this. He never knew anything about this. But a bunch of people got the license, called the cops, and eventually Brewer talked to the cops that night and convinced them he was pulling a prank. And a hitchhiker he said he picked up. That was one of about 7 versions he told. But he talked to the police about 8:30, and then he said, he talked to the police. The police said, "We need to see you in your car." And so he said, "Well, I need about 30 minutes. Can you hear me? They need about 30 minutes or 45 minutes. And he took her out to a deserted farmland. And he stabbed her 14 times, took a necktie, broke her neck, because he was my size, and as I said, Sherry was very small. And then slit her throat and threw her in a ditch, went to the police station, noticed he had blood on his hands and feet, washed it off, and then went up and talked to a sergeant who said, "What's this prank you've been pulling today?" He knew nothing about the sign until that point. Anyway, they ended up citing him for inducing panic. And he went home. And as I said, he came over to my house to help us, quote unquote. Now, I was a mess. I was crying 24 hours, 7 days a week. I moved in with my mom and dad. And I know I drove them crazy. If there was any good that happened that day, it was that the crime happened in Greene County, New Jersey. I'm in New Jersey now. But in Greene County, and Bill Skank was the prosecutor, and he had a very advanced victim witness program. Jeanette Adkins led that. And I met Bill for the first time. I can't tell you how soon. And Bill asked me, he goes, "Joe, this case is so obvious." He goes, "Here's your options. Death penalty," and I think it was life, 25 years at the time. I'm not sure. But, I told him, "Death penalty? Kidding me?" And he says, "I'm not going to do what you want. I just want to know what you think." I said, "Mostly I want you, Bill, to get her name out of the mud, that he's drugged her, and that the media, backed up." Well, as it turns out, he went to trial in September of 85. He was found guilty, 2.5 days. And then a month later, he was sentenced to death. I think, I was just talking to Derrick earlier, the first time I talked to him, I think they went to death row pretty much the same day. So that's what happened to Sherry. As I said, I was a mess. I wanted to die. I checked into psychiatric units of hospitals off and on. And I just had a hard time. I had always been a hard worker and succeeded, but I couldn't get any motivation. So then, we come to where the appeals start. And the appeals process, to me, were a nightmare. I think one thing that's consistent here is everybody agrees that all the speakers that talk agree that the system does not work. It's horrible. It's a horrible system. And someone said it's the best system in the world. It may be, but it's still broken. And I lived it. I went through 18 years of appeals on a guy who there was zero doubt to his guilt. And I didn't understand it. I didn't understand why is this happening. So I was very, 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 very angry for a long time. And then I at one point wrote a letter to all congressmen at the time, whatever, in Ohio, the Senate and the House. And one person, I got responses from several, but one person said something to me that blew my mind. He said, the death penalty process is not supposed to be efficient. It's supposed to be effective. And, I'm like, duh. It's supposed to be efficient. Any system's supposed to be efficient. That's my opinion on it. Well, it's broken. Anyway, the execution date was April 29, 2003. Sherry's mom, Myrtle, Bill Skank, the prosecutor, myself witnessed it. Lethal injection. All due respect to everybody. He went to sleep. I'm not saying I was looking for pain and agony. I'm not saying that. But he went to sleep. I was just sick of people saying, he's kind of a victim too and all. I couldn't stand it. And I felt good. I felt like I had attained what I wanted after 18 years. And I felt good for 2 days. And then my son was at a Special Olympics event. He's very sick. And this was 2 days after I got back from the execution. And he was at the Special Olympics. I was crying. I told my wife, Christine, my second wife, I said, I got to go somewhere. I don't want the kids to see me crying. And I went off to the woods. That doesn't sound right, but I moved over out of the way of the Olympic field, and I called my father. And I was hysterically crying, and I said, Dad, I got what I wanted. Why am I crying? I can't stop it. And he told me that, son, your mind, one of you two spoke about it earlier, your mind, as smart as you are, your mind convinced you that once Brewer was executed, she was going to walk through the door. Even though I knew that wasn't possible, something in my mind was there, and I bought that, That's why I'm upset. Even though intellectually and consciously I didn't think that. I knew that wasn't possible. So I became angrier and angrier. I was appalled, to be very honest, at what the Ohio public defenders got away with. And I got consumed with the whole process. Even after he was executed, I was consumed. And then February 14th, 2005, a little baby boy, was 9 at the time, was diagnosed with an incurable, terminal, rare genetic disorder. Only 5,000 people in the United States have it. And there's, as I said, there's no cure. It's called Friedreich's ataxia, but it's a neuromuscular degenerative disease, and I've almost lost my son 4 times. It attacks the heart mostly, and he's had 4 heart attacks. He's been helicoptered down to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia many times. I've been told 4 times by the specialist in CHOP he's not going to make it. Start preparing. My little guy, he's a fighter, and he lives in a long-term care unit of a hospital. I'm sorry. I'm 2 miles from it, and I see him every day. He also acted his older sister, Amanda, my baby doll, because it's genetic, and Amanda felt very guilty. She's like, why my baby brother? Why not me? And she developed some habits, and she was just having a hard time dealing with it, mostly because of guilt. Here's a picture, if you can see it. This was just a month ago. That obviously is the ugly guy, me. That's my little angel, Jacob, at his hospital. And that's my daughter, Amanda. These kids have been through hell. And they also were witness to me carrying all this anger around forever. And it got worse after Jake's diagnosis. I was like, God, come on. You took the love of my life, Sherry, from me. Now my little boy? I couldn't make any sense of it. I knew I was angry, and I couldn't do anything about it. I tried to get help, clergy and medical, but it was just still simmering. And I just never really learned how to deal with it. You know, in my case, backing up, as I said, I was lucky in that the victim witness group and prosecutor Bill Skank had hearts enormous. And they, to this day, I talk to the 2 of them. And during the trial, leading up to the trial, I was always kept advised of what was going on. I still get phone calls from them, where they just want to know how I'm doing. And how's the kids? So I was lucky in that regard, because I know it was different than a lot of other counties. And again, I know that not all victims get that. And I know all family victim survivors suffer, because it's a bewildering experience. You're in a fog. You don't know how to put your right foot ahead of your left foot for a long time. And again, these people helped me, but I think the state should do a lot more, because not every county has a Bill Skank or a Jeanette Adkins in it. And I love to hear what's going on. You know, that part of this initiative is to help victim survivors, because I think it's way overdue, mostly for others. You know, victim families, they want and need the truth about what's happening. That's what they want. They want the killer to be caught, obviously. We all want him to be proven guilty, you know, if it's appropriate. It's not like we're bloodthirsty people. And again, in my case, there was 0 doubt. Reasonable doubt? It was 0 doubt. Some people have lost a major breadwinner. There's help now for funeral expenses, I understand, in Ohio, but it takes a long time to get that money. I was lucky in that my family and friends put together a drive to collect money, donations, to help me pay for Sherry's funeral. Because I didn't have life insurance. I mean, we were too young. And then, you know, some other things. It's a simple thing, really, as far as what victim survivors need. We just need people to show they care. That's it. I know it's hard on people because they're not sure what to say. And they want to be careful they don't say the wrong thing. And I have some great friends that always told me, they'd be talking about something and go, oh, that kills me. I'm sorry, Joe. And so, you know, I understand how difficult it is. But all we want to do is just know that people care. And I had some great friends and family that I know they cared. They loved me. But not everybody gets that. Oops, sorry. Excuse me, I'm sorry. But there is, you know, victim families, there is something you can do. You've heard about the task force recommendations. I think it's way overdue, as I've already said. We need help, and it's about time no disrespect, Derrick, because what happened to you was horrible, that murder victim survivors get some attention from the state and some help from the state. My situation, again, was unique because of Greene County. But at the same time, I guess in theory, I feel like the death penalty can be appropriate in certain cases, but the system has to change. It's all about games. It's all about win versus lose. It's not about truth and justice. It's a game. And there's different motivations for each side. And who gets hurt? People like Derrick and his family, people like me and my family. The system is broken. You know, if the death penalty is causing that, then, you know, my change of heart came for a lot of reasons, but just the system has to change. If the death penalty causes it and can be proved to me, which I don't think it can, then get rid of it. I don't have a problem with that. As Abe and I talked, I want to help, but I want to help murder victim survivors most, and I don't want things to happen like what happened to Derrick at the same time. And I think it's possible for that to happen if it weren't for the games. It's possible. You can fill out those cards that Abe has, and I finally came. Well, let me back up one thing, because I forgot a very important part of this. When Sherry was missing after 2 days, she had left a card for me. I traveled on my job, and she had left a card for me that was hidden in the Bible, and we found it. My sister-in-law found it, and I read it, and it's very eerie. It said, I miss you more today than I did yesterday. Tomorrow's going to be really rough. And it was very eerie to me. And all this garbage that was out there about an affair infuriated me. And I pushed Bill Skank, you've got to introduce that card. He goes, they're going to have a problem. But he introduced it. And so that's another reason that I love him, because he worked very hard to make Sherry be a real human being. I'll wrap this up. What made me change my mind on the death penalty itself? And obviously, let's look at it very hard, because it can be fixed. The system needs to be fixed. I finally came to grips with how I was still carrying around so much pain, even 26 years after the execution. I just couldn't deal with it. And Jakey and Amanda being sick, and my mom died also like 6 months after Jakey's diagnosis, so it was very hard for me. Having the hindsight I do now on how painful it was, it bothers me that current victim survivors don't get the help that I did. I would say this is that, I thought I attained a victory, but the word closure doesn't exist. It's way overrated. It doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Third, I've had some incidents in my life which opened my eyes. I've developed more compassion for people in society who some might deem as being the dredges of society. I've cried with them. I prayed with them, and I've looked into their eyes, and I saw a hopelessness that really ate me up. All of those things helped me come to the different mindset than I had then. Let me be clear. I'm not sorry that Brewer was executed. He got what he deserved. But looking back, I think I possibly could have been better off if there was no death penalty, because I didn't have the foresight then to realize how awful the system is, and it ate me up. One story I'll tell you, I was consumed with it, as I said. One story I'll tell you that is very hard for me to tell. That little girl was 5 years old in 1995, 10 years after the murder, and well into the appellate process. And I was sitting in the sunroom reading a briefing from the Ohio Public Defenders this big, and she's out back swinging. And she goes, "Daddy, come on out and play with me." And I'm like, just a minute. I'm pouring over this, I'm really angry. Just a minute. Then she comes in, "Daddy," and she grabbed everything and threw it off my lap. "You're going to play with me, Daddy." And then I was like, oh my God, what have I been doing? I've allowed myself to be consumed by this crazy system, and I've kind of turned my back on my family. I didn't do that consciously, but in hindsight, I think I did. My priority should have been my life and my loved one. I know I was a good father. I'm a good father today, but I could have been better. If I didn't have to deal with all this stuff and allow myself to be consumed with it. Just remember, though, when I made the decision, or I talked to Bill Skank on my thoughts, there was no such thing as life without parole. And so if I had it to do all over again in that situation, I would say death penalty. But now I've got hindsight, and I'm like, whoa. And it just worries me that there's other murder victim survivors out there who are in my shoes from back then, and they think that it's going to make them feel better. And I'm living proof, at least in my case, that it doesn't work. You don't feel better. It ate me up. So that's why I'm asking every one of you tonight to join and support, did you say OTSE earlier? OTSE, I call it, tonight, and help pass these reforms on the way to improving the death penalty process, the system itself, if not get rid of the death penalty. I don't want to say that I'm totally against the death penalty now, but I certainly am a lot more aware of what it brings. And, in a lot of cases, certain things like what Derrick went through should have never happened. I read a book called I Am Troy Davis, A Kid in Georgia, and it was all garbage why he got executed. So I support everything that's going on right now, and Abe's trying to tell me to shut up right now. So I will. I thank you for your time and your patience, and let's fix this system, this task committee, whatever it is. I hope it works. Thank
you. I want to invite Joe to have a seat. I want to invite Derrick and Terry and Alice and Judge Brogan and Kevin Werner to join us up here. I want to say to the folks that are watching live streaming, it's going to cut off automatically probably within the next 5 to 10 minutes, and I apologize for that. But anybody that wants to send a question, we are also videotaping this with another camera, so we'll be able to tap that on to having this. So if you have a question, send it to Abe, abe@otse.org. And just grab a seat, folks. I think there's enough chairs. You can sit on down. So we're going to get into questions. And as long as I've got the live streaming going, I want to talk to the folks that are out there also and share that you can take action, the actions that Joe showed. And everybody here can take action, too. Here in the pews, you've got this action card. And I want to please ask whoever's got those piles next to you, pass them down. And you'll see that I don't know of any other organization in the country that's doing this, but in Ohio, we've got 2 check boxes on our action. You can say, I oppose the death penalty, but if we're going to have executions, let's make sure they're fair and accurate. And you can also say, I support the idea of the death penalty, but if we're going to have the death penalty, let's make sure they're fair and accurate. And let's implement these task force recommendations. That's what we're calling for. Until we get to the place where all the people who want to fix it and make it fair and accurate, which it is currently not, get to the point where they realize we can't do it, that's what we need to do, is work on fixing it. And then sooner or later, we're going to get around to ending it sooner, I hope, rather than later. Also online, if you like what you saw tonight and you want to help keep making it happen, click that donate button at otse.org. That's otse.org, and make a generous contribution. And until we hit the mark, we've got a matching grant of $10,000 from a couple of supporters and people that changed their mind about the death penalty, who are now some of our biggest supporters. And they're matching every donation that comes in until we hit $10,000. Peter or Allison, can you come in? Here's Allison. If you have a question, you can write it on a card and pass that up. I've got those questions. And if you would like an envelope to help send a contribution, then please raise your hand and Allison will give that to you. Those envelopes are up on the table too. So we've got our panel and we're going to take some questions. And let's see what we've got here. I'm going to start with one for Terry that came in by email. So I know where that one is. And I'm going to look at these other questions and put them together for folks. So let's see. For Terry Collins. What would be the impact on the Department of Corrections if Ohio did away with the death penalty? And thanks, folks online, for sending in these questions.
Well, actually, it would be little to no impact because there's no indication of any more violence in prison by people with the death sentence and not the death sentence. Actually, would probably save them money because death row has special staffing, special security, it's highly staffed, so probably in all likelihood would save money and would not hurt the prison population. In fact, I always thought Ohio may want to do something similar to what Missouri does. Missouri doesn't have a death row. Missouri mainstreams everybody in their population. So I don't think it would have any effect. It might have a positive effect from the standpoint it saves some taxpayer dollars.
Thank you, Terry. Here's another question from somebody watching out there, Tracy Kemi, I hope I'm saying that right. From your perspectives, what is the likelihood that these reforms will pass in Ohio, and what can we do to make sure that they do? Kevin, can I throw that to you? Why don't you pull it out?
Thank you. The likelihood, I think, is pretty high that the legislature is going to adopt a significant portion of the recommendations that have been put forth. As of today, there have been, I think, a total of 4 bills that have been introduced. We're expecting companion legislation to be introduced in the House of Representatives for bills that have been introduced in the Senate. So there is a serious mental illness exclusion, and Terry referenced that, Senate Bill 162. There is another piece of legislation that will enact some of the post-conviction proceedings recommendations. So altogether, there's a commitment for legislation for about 13 or so of the 23 recommendations that have to be legislated. So we're starting, not we, but the Ohio legislature is starting with a pretty significant chunk of those recommendations. The balance of the recommendations, more of them need to be adopted by court rule changes than by the legislative process. So I remain optimistic that legislators will enact the majority of the recommendations, but what we have to remember is, this is not about, well, pick the most important ones. Which ones are really the ones that matter the most? And the answer is all of them. So if you can't make all of these changes, then that's a significant indicator that the system is really sort of broken beyond repair, and then maybe it's time to have that question about whether or not Ohio should just do away with the death penalty once and for all.
Yeah, I think on this issue in Ohio, it may be different than in other states. We have term limits in Ohio. There's been the Ohio constitutional. There's been some movement to perhaps lengthen the time of term limits, but we still have term limits. A lot of politicians wouldn't be in Jack Kennedy's book on profiles and courage. You have to have legislators who are willing to buck the FOPs, the people in law enforcement who may be opposed to these recommendations. But the closer that a representative or a senator gets to the end of his term, that he cannot run again, he's more likely to be susceptible to showing some bravery or spunk in actually addressing the question of abolishing the death penalty. I think what we need to do is write to our representatives, For instance, representatives who are very conservative, like Jim Jordan, are very pro-life. If you're very strong pro-life, why wouldn't you be in favor of doing away with the death penalty? If you're in favor of reducing the budget, the cost of death penalty is at least 3 or 4 times as expensive as a normal murder prosecution. We don't have the exact handle on the cost of prosecutions, but we know that they're very, very expensive. And many of these recommendations are not going to be cheap. Faced with making these recommendations, which will be expensive, or actually doing away with the death penalty, is going to be interesting. You know, we're getting close to equipoise in terms of those people in the United States who are opposed to death penalty and those who are in favor of it. It's almost 50-50. There's very little political downside to coming out and doing away with the death penalty, at least as it used to be, as we used to think it. And the people who might be in favor of doing something about it are legislators and senator and the governor, people who have a backbone. And those people, as I said, very often have been governors in states in which they were from the weaker political party. The governor of Colorado, there are more Republicans than Democrats in Colorado, yet he came out in favor of a moratorium on the death penalty. I personally believe that if the governor took a strong lead in at least addressing these reforms in a meaningful way, and also looking at the question of whether we ought to do away with the death penalty. That quotation I didn't give you comes from a person who had worked for the National Rifle Association and who was a conservative. The man's name was Mark Hyden. He said, "The case is simple. Conservative policies are supposed to be pro-life, fiscally responsible, and limited government. We risk taking innocent life. It costs more than life without parole. And I can't think of a bigger government program than one where you can kill your citizens." And this is from a conservative. So don't count out your conservative representatives who you might think would be opposed to these reforms or even opposed to the abolition of the death penalty. See if they have a backbone and go ask them to give thoughtful consideration of these recommendations.
Thank you, Judge Brogan. And that actually, I'm going to give everybody a chance to address some of these questions, but I want to move them forward too, because I know people have babysitters to get back to and that sort of thing. But that does lead to a couple other things. One of the other questions is what can an individual like myself do to help repeal the death penalty in Ohio? Thanks, Peter, for that question. And there's many things that people can do. If you can pray about it, you can put your faith into action about it, and there's a whole list of things that, part of this event this evening is part of what we call our Faith Leader Initiative. It's sponsored by the Archdiocese. The idea is to get speakers like these before captive audiences. Tonight was a See Who Comes event. You all came out. Thank you for coming. But we need to get to the place where Derrick comes and does 5 minutes during the Mass, when everybody's there already because they're coming for the Mass. And then those who can and wish to stay and hear him tell his whole story during the coffee hour afterwards can do so. We need to have opportunities for Alice and Judge Brogan to come to the adult education seminar, or for Terry to come and talk to the women's group, whatever it is. We need to find those opportunities within our faith communities or within other civic organizations. We need to find people who live, and this is the neat thing. We don't have to change anybody's mind, really. We just have to find the people that agree with us and get them to do something. And what is that thing? At the very basic, contact your legislators. Fill out one of these cards. You can take extras and get people to fill them out and send them back to us. We're collecting them so that we can hand deliver them in stacks, and make sure people are getting to their legislators. But you can also help identify people that are with us who want the death penalty to be fair and accurate, whether or not they agree with the death penalty. Find those people, get them signed up with Ohioans to Stop Executions or on the Catholic Action Network or whatever whoever is doing the work in this community. Okay? That's number one. If you've got resources, time to volunteer, email us, info@otc.org, or come fill out the form on our webpage, and we'll find some volunteer activity that you could do. If you've got money or know somebody with money, we can use it and put it to good use doing this work, hiring more staff, paying for the, we've got a lot of expenses doing this kind of event and other events and just maintaining our office, and we can use help like that. We're a nonprofit, but we're a C3 and a C4. We need more money in our C4 end. That's the part that's doing the lobbying. Because now, for the first time ever in OTSU's history, there's actual legislation that we could be campaigning behind. So we need to do those sorts of things. So there's something for you to do as an individual, whether you are 10 years old or 90 years old, whether you are fully able or have some limitations. We've got some way that you can help, and just get with us. The next question. Somebody asked, when does this legislative reform start? And many people plead down to lesser charges. Does this impact that? So, well, the reform has already started. Bills have been introduced. Some have already been passed. That the panel that's going to look at the needs of victim family members is half of it's already been named, and we hope the other half will get named soon. The people that have been named are Representatives Deaver, Condit, and not Butler, it's Rogers, right? In any case, that's happening. The bill on mental illness is happening. Other bills are about to be introduced, so we're looking at that. So this next question here is for Derrick. Okay, and where'd the other part of it go? Here we are. So there's several questions that are on the same theme, and I'm going to put them all together here. First, if we think there may be innocent people on Ohio's death row, which recommendations can address the ones that are innocent right now? Okay, and that's on the flyer. Okay, so don't worry about having to answer that. Those recommendations, those are help prevent future executions. What's going to help people on death row right now is more litigation, is the lawyers having the opportunity to raise the issues, okay? But, Derrick, there's two questions. I'm going to combine them here. Who was the prosecutor who withheld the evidence that could have pointed to your innocence? And was there anything done to discipline that person? And should he or she have been disciplined?
Yes. The prosecutor was Mark Priya-Meyer, Hamilton County, Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, Hamilton County. And I believe people should be held accountable for what they actions, you know. And like with man, I think they should be held accountable, you know.
Okay. But they're not being held accountable. Do you know why?
Yeah, I don't know why, but it's hard to prosecute a prosecutor.
Judge Brogan, can you add a little bit to why prosecutors?
It's like a thin blue line. It's like a thin blue line. You know, they could get away with it. You know, a lot of these prosecutors, they're finding out that they didn't execute the innocent people, and they're being brought up on charges around the United States right now. Like in the Carlos de Luna case in Texas, they might this might be the first time we see a prosecutor get convicted of wrongful conviction. And he knew Carlos was innocent, and he withheld all the evidence, and they killed this young man anyway, you know. And like in the Troy Davis case, you know, they found out that they withheld all this evidence, and Troy dead now. And in Carolyn Todd Willingham, this just burned me up when I hear about his case, you know. His whole family in the graveyard right now, you know. And he was charged with his 3 daughters' murder, and they found out that, you know, they withheld all this evidence that the house was had faulty electricity wires, and it caused the house to burn up and kill his 3 daughters. But he was charged with their murders, and he was executed for their murders. And they found out that he was innocent. And like in Troy Davis' case, you know, if the jurors said if they would have heard the evidence in Troy case that they withheld, that they wouldn't have never convicted him or charged him with a thing, you know, he'd be a free man. He'd be up here, probably up here speaking with us right now, you know. But, yeah, and what was the other question?
Say again?
What was the other question?
I think that's good for now because I'm getting message that the people that work need to take down the stage. So I want to take one more quick question, then we're going to wrap it up, and we can meet people out here and talk until they kick us out. But they need to take down the stage, and the people that are working want to do this. So the last question, then, just to wrap up and finish on that, Judge Brogan, can you share with us why prosecutors aren't held accountable? As a former prosecutor yourself.
Well, you know, the Supreme Court over the years have reversed convictions. I'm talking about the Ohio Supreme Court first. Have reversed convictions and indicated that when it was discovered that evidence was withheld and should have been turned over and reversed for a new trial. In most instances, it's reversed for a new trial to see what the trier of fact or the jury would have done had they known about another suspect or someone else who has confessed to the crime, or the hair sample, you know, was baloney science, for instance. We had a number of cases in recent years where the FBI had people, hair specialists, so to speak, that had discovered that all of this evidence was false. The thing about it is the prosecutor has to be aggressive in seeking out justice, wherever that ends up. And very often, prosecutors are timid. They let the police bring the case to them, and they present what the police present, instead of going to the police department and saying, I want to know about any other suspects that you've had in this case, any other evidence that you might have that indicates that this defendant may not have committed this offense, and I want every piece of evidence. Whether you think it's pertinent or not, I'll decide because I'm prosecuting the case. Unless you're that aggressive. Now, in terms of people who have been wrongfully convicted, many of these people have brought lawsuits. Not only does the state pay for somebody who is actually innocent, they have to prove that they're actually innocent. But if they prove it by a preponderance of the evidence, they get some compensation from the state. But if you can prove that the prosecutor withheld evidence favorable to you and you were imprisoned, you can sue the prosecutor privately. You can sue them for doing that. Judges are immune, but prosecutors are not. And so the Supreme Court of the United States wrote a case here in recent years called Connick versus Myers, where the prosecutor, Harry Connick Sr., Harry Connick Jr., the singer's father, failed to train his prosecutors. And there were a number of reversals in New Orleans Parish where evidence had been withheld by the police department or by the prosecutor. In the famous case of Connick, or in that case, Thompson barely escaped death row, and he turned around and sued Harry Connick Sr., the prosecutor, for failing to train his prosecutors in how to turn over favorable evidence. And he won a huge judgment, $3 million he won. And went to the U.S. Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court reversed the case, and Justice I'm trying to think. The little justice. No, the liberal justice. The little. Yeah, Justice Ginsburg. I'm sorry, I'm losing it. Justice Ginsburg wrote a scathing dissent about reversing this $3 million judgment that Thompson should have gotten, and said that the prosecutor was reckless in not training his prosecutors better. Prosecutors want to win, and they don't like to lose big sensational cases. And we have to say to the prosecutor, if you conceal evidence, you'll pay. You'll pay the person who suffered.
Yeah. Thank you, Judge Brogan. And you know, there's so much more that could be said. We're happy to say it in chat. But I want to thank personally Terry Collins, and Derrick Jamison, Joe Byrne, Judge Brogan, Sister Alice, Brother Kevin, and all of you for coming out tonight. This is just the beginning. Take what you've heard tonight and share it. Take the materials, share them. Help us bring this back to this community and others. And thank you very much, everybody who helped make this happen.